In the ancient world, being left-handed was considered more than just unusual. It was seen as a sign of weakness, a physical defect that marked someone as different and potentially unreliable. Left-handed people were viewed with suspicion, excluded from certain roles, and often forced to adapt to a world designed entirely for right-handed individuals. But sometimes what the world sees as a disability can become the perfect advantage. This is the story of Ehud, a left-handed judge of Israel who used his supposed weakness to carry out one of the most audacious assassinations in ancient history, liberating his people from 18 years of brutal oppression with a single, perfectly executed stroke. It's a story about how perceived limitations can become hidden strengths, and how the most unlikely heroes can emerge from the most unexpected places.
The oppressive of Eglon. For 18 years, the people of Israel had lived under the crushing domination of Eglon, the king of Moab. This was not merely political subjugation. It was systematic humiliation designed to break the spirit of an entire nation. Eglon had not been content with simply conquering Israelite territory. He had made himself and his allies the masters of every aspect of Israelite life. The biblical record notes that he had formed a coalition with the Ammonites and Amalekites, traditional enemies of Israel, creating a unified force that could dominate the region from multiple directions. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the military conquest. Eglon had established his headquarters in Jericho, the very city that Joshua had conquered centuries earlier as Israel entered the Promised Land. The symbolism was unmistakable. The great victories of the past meant nothing. The promises of God were empty, and the future held only continued servitude. Under Eglon's rule, the Israelites were reduced to a tributary people, forced to pay crushing taxes that impoverished their communities and enriched their oppressors. The tribute payments were not just economic burdens, they were ritual humiliations designed to remind the Israelites of their subjugated status. But what made Eglon's oppression particularly galling was the man himself. The biblical writers describe him bluntly. He was a very fat man, whose physical obesity seemed to symbolize his gluttony for power, his consumption of Israel's resources, and his indulgent lifestyle built on the suffering of others. This was not a noble enemy who commanded respect through martial prowess or political wisdom. This was a tyrant whose primary qualification for rule seemed to be his appetite for food, for wealth, for the domination of others. For 18 years, the Israelites endured this humiliation, watching their children grow up as subjects of a foreign king, seeing their harvest carted away to feed Moabite armies, witnessing the gradual erosion of their identity as God's chosen people. But oppression, however systematic, cannot entirely crush the human spirit, and sometimes, from the most unexpected quarters, resistance begins to take shape.
The unlikely deliverer. Ehud came from the tribe of Benjamin, a people known for their fierce independence and their skill in warfare. The Benjamites had a reputation as warriors who could fight with both hands, equally deadly whether wielding a sword in their right hand or their left. But Ehud was different, even among his own people. He was restricted in his right hand, a Hebrew phrase that indicates he was left-handed by necessity rather than choice. Whether through injury, birth defect, or some other limitation, his right hand was essentially useless for the tasks that mattered most in his world. In ancient Israelite society, this would have been seen as a significant disability. Most tools, weapons, and social customs were designed for right-handed people. A man who could not effectively use his dominant hand would be at a disadvantage in warfare, in craftsmanship, and in many of the daily activities that defined masculine competence. But what others saw as Ehud's weakness would prove to be his greatest strength. His left-handedness would become the key to infiltrating enemy security, approaching an untouchable target, and striking a blow for freedom that would liberate an entire nation. The biblical account doesn't tell us how Ehud came to be chosen as Israel's deliverer, or whether he volunteered for the mission or was selected by others. What it does tell us is that when the moment came to act against Eglon's oppression, Ehud was ready with a plan that was as brilliant as it was audacious. He would carry out his mission not in spite of his disability, but because of it.
The weapon and the plan. Ehud's plan began with the creation of a custom weapon designed specifically for his unique situation. He commissioned a double-edged dagger, 18 inches long, short enough to be concealed, but long enough to be lethal. More importantly, he had this weapon made to be worn on his right thigh, where left-handed weapons were never expected to be found. In the ancient world, right-handed warriors wore their swords on their left side for easy drawing with the right hand. Security procedures were designed with this universal pattern in mind. But a left-handed warrior would naturally wear his weapon on the right side for drawing with the left hand. This meant that Ehud could carry a deadly blade into the most secure locations in the kingdom without raising suspicion from guards who had been trained to check all the obvious places. The weapon itself was carefully designed for concealment. Unlike the longer swords typically carried by warriors, Ehud's dagger was compact enough to be hidden under his clothing, strapped to his thigh where the folds of his robe would naturally conceal its outline. But the plan required more than just a hidden weapon. It required a legitimate reason to gain access to King Eglon himself. For this, Ehud would use his people's humiliation as his cover. He volunteered to be part of the delegation that would deliver Israel's annual tribute payment to the Moabite king, a regular ceremony that would give him the perfect opportunity to get close to his target. The psychological brilliance of this approach cannot be overstated. Ehud would present himself not as a potential threat, but as a representative of a defeated people coming to pay homage to their conqueror. The very act of tribute payment was designed to reinforce the power dynamic between ruler and subject, to remind everyone present of who was dominant and who was subservient. No one would expect the tribute bearer to be carrying anything more dangerous than a purse full of silver. The ceremony itself would provide the perfect camouflage for what was actually a carefully planned assassination.
The approach. When the day came for the tribute ceremony, Ehud joined the official delegation from Israel, carrying himself like any other subject coming to pay homage to his king. The dagger strapped to his right thigh remained perfectly concealed beneath his robes, invisible to the guards who undoubtedly searched the tribute bearers for weapons. But those guards, trained in the security procedures of their time, checked the left side for right-handed weapons. They patted down the obvious places where a conventional warrior would carry a sword or knife. They found nothing suspicious because they were looking in all the wrong places. The tribute ceremony itself must have been a painful experience for any patriotic Israelite. Here were the representatives of God's chosen people, bowing before a foreign king, acknowledging his superiority, presenting him with wealth extracted from their own communities. For Ehud, however, every moment of the ceremony was an opportunity to study his target, to observe the security arrangements, to plan his next move. While others saw humiliation, he saw reconnaissance. The initial ceremony concluded without incident. The tribute was presented, the ritual acknowledgments were made, and the Israelite delegation prepared to return home. King Eglon, no doubt satisfied with this latest demonstration of his power over his subjects, dismissed them with the casual arrogance of a man who had never had reason to fear the people he ruled. But Ehud was not finished. As the delegation departed, he made an excuse to return alone, claiming that he had a secret message for the king that could only be delivered in private. This was perhaps the most dangerous moment of the entire operation. Ehud was now separating himself from the safety of the group, approaching the king without witnesses, relying entirely on his ability to maintain his cover story until the moment came to strike. One suspicious glance, one unexpected security check, one moment of hesitation on his part, and the mission would end in his own death rather than his target's.
The private audience. King Eglon, intrigued by the possibility of secret intelligence from his Israelite subjects, agreed to see Ehud privately. This decision reveals something important about the psychology of oppression. Tyrants are often eager to hear secrets about their subjects, to learn about potential threats or opportunities for further exploitation. Eglon probably expected to receive information about Israelite resistance activities, or perhaps intelligence about other regional powers that might be useful for his own political maneuvering. The biblical account emphasizes that this private meeting took place in Eglon's upper room of coolness, a private chamber designed for comfort and relaxation, away from the heat and bustle of the main palace. This was the king's most private space, where he could let down his guard and speak freely without concern for how his words might be interpreted by courtiers or foreign dignitaries. It was also, from Ehud's perspective, the perfect location for an assassination. A private room meant no witnesses, no guards in earshot, and no immediate help available for the victim. As Ehud entered the king's presence, he would have appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be, a subject bringing secret information to his ruler. His posture, his manner of speaking, his apparent deference would all have reinforced Eglon's sense of security and superiority. The king had no reason to suspect that the man standing before him was carrying a weapon, or that the secret message he claimed to bear was actually a death sentence. But every detail of the encounter was carefully choreographed in Ehud's mind. He knew exactly where his weapon was concealed, exactly how he would draw it, exactly where he would strike for maximum effectiveness. Most importantly, he knew that his left-handedness would give him a crucial advantage in the moment of truth. When he reached for his weapon, he would be moving in a direction that no right-handed opponent would expect.
The moment of truth. The biblical account of what happened next is both dramatic and precise. Then Ehud said, "I have a message from God for you." So he arose from his seat. Then Ehud reached with his left hand, took the dagger from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. The phrase, "I have a message from God for you," was not merely dramatic flourish. It was a theological statement about the nature of justice and divine judgment. From Ehud's perspective, he was not simply committing murder. He was serving as an instrument of divine justice against a tyrant who had oppressed God's people. The reference to Eglon rising from his seat is significant for several reasons. It suggests that the king was showing respect for what he believed was a divine message, perhaps even religious reverence that made him more vulnerable to attack. It also means that when Ehud struck, his target was standing, possibly even leaning forward in anticipation of hearing this divine communication.
The positioning would have been perfect for a surprise attack. The attack itself demonstrates the deadly effectiveness of Ehud's preparation. His left hand moved to his right thigh, exactly the opposite of what any security training would have prepared guards or the king himself to expect. By the time Eglon realized what was happening, the 18-inch blade was already buried in his body. The biblical description is graphic in its detail. Even the hilt went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the dagger out of his belly, and his entrails came out. This visceral description serves multiple purposes in the narrative. It emphasizes the completeness of Ehud's victory over his oppressor, the finality of the tyrant's defeat, but it also highlights the physical reality of what Eglon represented. His obesity symbolized his consumption of Israel's resources, and now that very obesity was contributing to his death as the fat closed around the weapon. The detail about not withdrawing the dagger also suggests tactical thinking on Ehud's part. A blade left in the wound would prevent massive bleeding that might alert guards, buying him precious time to escape.
The escape. What happened after the assassination reveals Ehud's careful planning and his understanding of palace security procedures. Instead of fleeing immediately, he took time to lock the doors of the upper room from the inside before escaping through another exit. This detail might seem insignificant, but it was actually crucial to his survival. By locking the doors, Ehud created the impression that the king was still inside, perhaps resting or conducting private business. This would delay the discovery of the body and give him additional time to get away. The biblical account notes that when the king's servants returned and found the doors locked, they assumed he was relieving himself in the private chamber and were reluctant to disturb him. This cultural detail explains why the discovery of the murder was delayed even longer than Ehud might have hoped. Ancient palace etiquette required servants to respect their master's privacy during intimate moments, and the locked doors sent exactly the signal that would keep them at bay for the maximum amount of time. By the time the servants finally broke down the doors and found their king dead on the floor with a dagger protruding from his belly, Ehud was long gone. He had passed by the stone images at Gilgal, landmarks that marked the boundary between Moabite-controlled territory and the hill country where Israelite resistance could find safe haven. The man with the disabled right hand had used his left hand to strike a blow that would liberate his people from 18 years of oppression.
The call to arms. Ehud's mission, however, was not complete with the assassination of King Eglon. He understood that killing the tyrant was only the first step in a larger campaign for liberation. The Moabite forces still controlled key positions throughout Israelite territory, and without immediate follow-up action, Eglon's death might only result in the appointment of an even more brutal successor. So Ehud immediately moved to capitalize on the chaos that his assassination had created. He blew a trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, calling the Israelites to arms and announcing that the moment for rebellion had arrived. His message to the assembled fighters was simple and direct. "Follow me, for the Lord has delivered your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand." The phrase "follow me" is significant. Ehud was not just reporting Eglon's death, but positioning himself as the leader of the liberation movement. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Men who had lived under Moabite oppression for 18 years suddenly saw an opportunity for freedom, and they seized it with the desperation of people who had nothing left to lose. Ehud's strategy for the broader campaign was as clever as his assassination plan had been. He led the Israelite forces to seize the fords of the Jordan River, the key crossing points that controlled movement between Moabite territory and the areas they had occupied in Israel. By controlling these strategic positions,
Ehud could prevent Moabite reinforcements from reaching their isolated garrisons, while also cutting off the escape routes for enemy forces already in Israelite territory. The biblical account records that they did not allow anyone to cross over, and that they killed about 10,000 Moabites, all stout, valiant men. Not a man escaped. This was not just a military victory, it was the complete elimination of Moabite power in the region, ensuring that Eglon's death would lead to lasting liberation rather than temporary disruption.
The victory and its meaning. The success of Ehud's campaign had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military results. The biblical record notes that Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years. 80 years represents the longest period of peace in the entire book of Judges, a testament to the thoroughness of Ehud's victory and the effectiveness of his leadership. But the deeper significance of Ehud's story lies not in the scale of his military success, but in what it reveals about the nature of strength, weakness, and divine providence in human affairs. Here was a man who had been marked from birth or injury as different, as less capable than his peers, as someone whose physical limitation would prevent him from achieving the kind of success that society valued. Yet it was precisely this perceived limitation that became the key to his greatest triumph. His left-handedness, which others saw as a disability, became the perfect qualification for a mission that required stealth, deception, and the ability to approach danger from an unexpected angle. The weapon that others could not effectively conceal, he could hide in plain sight. The attack that others could not have executed, he carried out with deadly precision. The escape that others could not have planned, he accomplished through careful attention to psychological and cultural details. From a theological perspective, Ehud's story illustrates the biblical theme that God often chooses the unlikely, the overlooked, and the apparently weak to accomplish his purposes in the world. This is not because weakness itself is somehow superior to strength, but because those whom society has written off are often the ones who have learned to think creatively, to find alternative approaches, to succeed through wit and determination rather than conventional advantages. Ehud's story also demonstrates the importance of understanding your enemy's assumptions and using those assumptions against them. The Moabite security apparatus was designed to defend against conventional threats, right-handed warriors carrying weapons in predictable places, approaching danger through obvious channels. But Ehud succeeded precisely because he was not conventional, because his approach came from angles that conventional security could not anticipate or prevent.
The legacy of the left hand. Ehud ruled Israel as a judge for the rest of his life, presiding over 8 decades of peace and prosperity that stand as testimony to the effectiveness of his leadership and the completeness of his victory over Moabite oppression. But his lasting legacy extends far beyond his military and political achievements. He became a symbol of how perceived weaknesses can become hidden strengths, how unconventional approaches can succeed where conventional methods fail. In the broader narrative of biblical history, Ehud's story fits into a recurring pattern of unlikely heroes. David, the shepherd boy who defeated Goliath; Gideon, the fearful farmer who routed vast armies; Yael, the nomad woman who killed a mighty general. These stories consistently emphasize that divine purposes are often accomplished through people who don't fit into society's expectations of what heroes should look like or how they should behave. But Ehud's story is unique in its focus on physical difference as a source of tactical advantage. While other biblical heroes succeeded despite their apparent limitations, Ehud succeeded specifically because of his limitation. His left-handedness was not an obstacle he had to overcome. It was the key qualification that made his mission possible. This distinction has profound implications for how we think about diversity, inclusion, and the value of different perspectives in solving complex problems. Too often, organizations and societies focus on helping people with differences overcome their limitations to fit into conventional patterns of success. Ehud's story suggests a different approach, looking for ways that different perspectives, different approaches, and different capabilities can provide solutions that conventional thinking cannot imagine. The goal is not to make everyone the same, but to recognize how our differences can become sources of collective strength and innovative problem-solving. In the end, the left-handed assassin who fooled palace security reminds us that in a world that often values conformity over creativity, the most powerful breakthroughs may come from the people who think differently, not despite their differences, but because of them. The dagger that ended Eglon's tyranny was wielded by a hand that others saw as weak, guided by a mind that understood how to turn weakness into strength, carried by a man who refused to let his limitations define his possibilities. 18 years of oppression ended with 18 inches of steel, placed with precision by someone whom conventional wisdom would have written off as unfit for the mission. It was a victory that proved, once and for all, that the most dangerous opponent is often the one whom nobody sees coming, especially when that opponent has learned to make their greatest weakness their most powerful weapon.